Hi, this is Dr. Doug Lucas, the Chief Science Officer of PhD Weight Loss and Nutrition. Have you ever been told that a calorie is a calorie and that weight gain is as simple as eating less and moving more? Well, if so, and that hasn't worked for you, then you may be interested in the video that follows this introduction. In this video, we talk about what's called the hormonal theory of obesity, or reasons why you might gain weight other than you're eating too much and moving too little. We compare that to the traditional theory of calories in and calories out, and why when you look at simple macronutrients like carbohydrates and how they affect the body, if you compare that then to a medical diagnosis like diabetes and metabolic syndrome and how the hormones are affecting the body from a physiologic standpoint, you can really understand why obesity may be related to a hormonal issue. Not that you need hormone replacement or hormone supplements, but your diet, your nutrition, and your behaviors may need to be tailored to change your hormones to support weight loss in a healthy way that will allow you to keep it off. So I hope you enjoyed this video and it answers some questions for you. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to any of the PhD clinics and ask about this theory of obesity. I hope you enjoy. Thank you for joining us. So this is the PhD Advisory Board live stream and Q&A for clients. The topic of today is going to be sugar, obesity, and diabetes, connecting the dots. And really what that means is the long way of saying the hormonal theory of obesity. So we'll talk a lot about what that means, why it's different than what we're traditionally taught, and what we can do about it. So I will go ahead and get started. So if you haven't met me or been introduced to me through the website, my name is Dr. Doug Lucas. I am the Chief Science Officer for PhD Weight Loss and Nutrition. I am an orthopedic surgeon by trade, but have been working with this organization and working with my wife, Dr. Ashley Lucas, for I don't know how many years now, but for several years, and pursuing this passion of nutrition and a hormonal approach and a behavioral approach to weight loss and weight maintenance, which has really become the passion of my career. So a quick medical disclaimer, this is not a substitution for medical advice. I am not your doctor, probably, at least in this fashion. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. I cannot make individual recommendations. I'm talking about people in general, and I cannot make individual recommendations through this type of platform. Any changes in medications or habits should be discussed with your own physician team. And we do not staff a physician through a traditional platform, and our coaches cannot be a substitute for your physician. So we just need to get that out there. All right, so I'm going to make a poll live here, and we're going to put this out there. And if you guys want to click on what you think is the largest contributor to obesity in modern society, I would love to hear your opinion. So a little quick history on sugar. So this is a quote from 1857, and I think it's really interesting. And it says, "We are beyond question the greatest sugar consumers in the world, and many of our diseases may be attributed to too free use of sweet food." That was in 1857. In 2016, a very similar comment to say, "I am not prepared to look back at my time here in this parliament doing this job and saying to my children's generation, I'm sorry, we knew there was a problem with sugary drinks. We knew it caused disease, but we ducked the difficult decisions and we did nothing." So between those two, maybe not a lot has changed. And if you look at how much sugar we're actually consuming, it is not insignificant. You know, back in the early 1800s, it was about 18 pounds per person per year. And now we're up to about 180. That's about a half of a pound of sugar a day per person. And many of us, particularly PhD clients who I love talking to, we know that we're reducing sugar already. So that means that 180 pounds is probably shifted more towards people that haven't learned this about sugar and haven't learned to identify it, which means that they're probably eating more than that a day. And I've seen estimates that it's significantly more than that. So a real quick primer on what do we talk about with sugar. So what is sugar? So sugar is a few different things. If you look over to the right, you can see that sucrose is table sugar. That's what we typically think of as sugar. That is half of this thing called fructose, half of this thing called glucose. So glucose and fructose on the left side of the slide. Glucose is what you typically think of as table sugar. I'm sorry, I just said that wrong, is blood sugar. Blood sugar is what your body absorbs, it runs through your body and has a response to. Fructose, or fructose, depending on which country you're from, fructose is considered fruit sugar, but it's also found in a lot of other forms, and it has a very different pathway, and we'll talk about the details of that. So as a macronutrient in whole, sugar fills into the whole group of carbohydrates, right? And we all know, we've been told carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram, same as protein, less than half that of fat. And we'll talk about the significance of that statement and why that can be very misleading. So glucose as a sugar, glucose, according to the World Health Organization, is actually not a food, it's actually a medication. It is so because it's absorbed directly into the bloodstream from your gut, and there's a hormonal response as a result of that. So insulin will come out of the organ called the pancreas, and it will try to push the blood sugar, the glucose, into cells so it can have its effect. If you eat too much glucose, then it'll either get stored as glycogen or it'll get stored as fat. And the amount of glucose that is actually available in your bloodstream is very, very small. So it's very easy to eat too much for most people. Fructose, on the other hand, has a very different pathway. So fructose does not get absorbed directly into the bloodstream. It does not have an insulin response. It goes to the liver. It goes directly to the liver, and your liver will either then use it for energy if it can, or it pushes it into the storage form, which is called glycogen. And once that's filled up, then it converts it into fat, and then it packs it in a triglyceride, and then it shifts it out into the body to be stored. And if you've heard the word triglyceride, or if you have elevated triglycerides, it might surprise you to know that the predominant place where triglycerides come from is from conversion of fructose in your liver into a saturated fat and packed up as a triglyceride. So it's actually not from eating dietary fat for the most part. Sucrose, again, table sugar. This is the medicine food that we are usually exposed to. It is a very powerful stimulant. That's why it tastes so darn good. It uses the same pathway as other stimulants or other drugs that are on the reward pathway, like nicotine, cocaine, heroin, alcohol. And some people would argue that it actually has a more powerful neuronal response than things like cocaine and alcohol. That's why if you look at the Alcoholics Anonymous literature, it'll say if you're having a craving, grab something sweet, because something sweet will help curb your craving for those things that are less addictive, and that includes alcohol, cocaine, narcotics, all those things. So it's very, very powerful. High fructose corn syrup, we don't need to spend a lot of time about, but just know that this is synthetic, it's manufactured. It has a higher fructose level, which has some significant implications. It's a little bit sweeter. It's a liquid, and that's why you find it in drinks. And I would essentially say do your best to avoid this. So the debate of whether or not sugar is good for you or should even be included in the diet has been around for a long time. These quotes from the late 1600s and early 1700s demonstrate that there has been an argument between different bodies for hundreds of years. You know, this Dr. Willis, who said that sugar is causing this spike of type 2 diabetes in the 1670s. It couldn't have been a big spike then. But he related it to cider, beer, and sharp wines, whereas Dr. Slayer, early 1700s, said, no, you should give it to everybody. To defraud infants of sugar is cruel. But then noted that it was really good at fattening hogs and humans. So there are people that have thought that perhaps we shouldn't give it to people because of this concerning appearance that it fattens people very, very quickly. And so these are two physicians that say, gosh, if you give people sugar, they seem to get heavier. And then there is Dr. Jocelyn, and we'll talk more about Dr. Jocelyn because he is basically the guy that wrote the book on diabetes. He was an advocate for grouping sugar with all carbohydrates and saying that sugar is a carbohydrate. They're all the same. They all have the same effect. A calorie is a calorie, and it's dietary fat that you need to worry about. He was ahead of his time, but unfortunately that became even more popular. And even up until this last decade, this is Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, who clearly stated that we don't need to demonize any industry. She was referring to sugar. We should restrict empty calories, but really let's focus on fat because that's where the problem is. And if you take fat out of a food product, then you're most likely going to substitute it with sugar if you want people to eat it. All right, so let's look at the poll. And it looks like the majority of people said that the largest contributor to obesity in modern society is highly processed foods. And that is a reasonable answer. I'm going to propose that the response should be the body's response to sugar consumption. And I'm going to see if I can't convince you that that's true. Okay, so here we are today. So we know that in the United States, there are 75% of adults that are considered overweight. There are 88% of adults that are considered metabolically unwell. That means that just a little over 10% of us actually meet the criteria for metabolic health. That is absolutely disturbing and concerning, and something that we should be doing a whole lot about. This is a look at what's happened in obesity in the United States from 1990 to essentially 2020. So this is 30 years of data. And you can see that we went from, less than 10% to 10 to 15% to now in a number of states. You can't really see those numbers, but it's over 35, 40%. And it's becoming half of the population in a number of states, and it's only getting worse. This is my favorite graph, though, to look at this data. And what this graph shows is that around 1977, something happened that caused this incredible shift in the rates of obesity and overweight and the extremely obese, which was very, very low prior to this time. That shift is not because we all got lazy and we all started eating poorly, kind of, or eating more. It's because there was a shift in the recommendations. 1977 is when the food guide pyramid was published. And you can see that, boy, it looks like we really should all be eating a lot of bread, rice, pasta, cereal. You can see that sweets is listed up there at the top, and sugars is actually included in that use sparingly. But what's really deceiving about this is when these products are manufactured, sugar is built into the base of the pyramid, not excluded. And so people just don't know that they're eating it, typically. That led to this energy balance or energy theory of obesity or energy balance hypothesis, and that obesity is a result of eating too much and exercising too little. I love this little graph because it says, I'm hungry over here, and it says I'm stuffed over here, and if I eat just the right amount, then I'm going to feel great, and I'm not going to gain weight, I'm not going to lose weight. And that is a really great theory because it makes sense, but when you look at the details of it, it actually doesn't make sense, and I'll explain why I think that's true. But over the last 50 years, physicians have gotten into the habit of saying that people that are overweight and obese are gluttonous and they exhibit sloth. You actually see that in the literature. And I think it is a terrible misrepresentation of why people have been gaining weight. Physicians like to invoke what's called the first law of thermodynamics, basically saying that a calorie is a calorie. And I'll explain why I think that that is a misrepresentation of that law of physics. Because the other solution is this hormonal hypothesis. This is not new. This has been around since the 20s, 30s, 40s. This was a book that was written decades ago about sugar by John Yudkin. It was actually pretty darn popular, but it got beat out by the diet heart hypothesis and Ansel Keys. These two really went head to head, and unfortunately he lost. And so this hormonal hypothesis, which basically says that sugar consumption leads to insulin secretion, which leads to this thing called hyperinsulinemia, puts all the cells in this fed state that you guys have heard of, and leads to obesity, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes. Now, I would argue that not everybody goes down this pathway, but I think that it is probably the dominant pathway, and that's why calorie restriction doesn't necessarily work, and why we need to look at other avenues to lose weight, and more importantly, to keep it off. One of the challenges in Yudkin's day was that the hormones that they knew about and could prove existed were hard to test. They couldn't objectively identify them easily, and they didn't know about all of them. So insulin was identified at that point. But other things like leptin, ghrelin, how do you measure basal metabolic rate, energy expenditure, they didn't have good measures for those things. So they didn't really have a way to say, hey, this is a hormone problem, and the energy theory just seemed to make basic sense. And I think that's one of the reasons why it lost out. So here's Dr. Jocelyn again. So I literally wrote the book on diabetes. And when he wrote this, not when he wrote this book, when he was a medical student and learned about diabetes, he estimated the rate of diabetes was 0.3% in an inpatient population. So that's not even in the United States at large. In 2015, the data would suggest that over half of our population, adult population, is diabetic or pre-diabetic. So that is a tremendous shift. The significance of that I will demonstrate for you. So my definition of diabetes, and if you haven't seen my lecture on diabetes and you want to learn more about it, this is posted in the research corner for all of our clients. So my definition of diabetes is that it is a potentially reversible nutritional condition that's characterized by high levels of blood glucose and high levels of insulin. I don't think anybody would argue that, particularly the insulin part. And we know that diabetes is the end product of this metabolic derangement where insulin is elevated. This is a big deal because you can see in this list of the top 10 causes of death, diabetes hangs out there, number 6, or number 7, actually. But I drew arrows on all of the other conditions which are related to diabetes. And I think that you can see that 6 out of the top 10 are directly linkable to diabetes, and that it is something that we should be doing our best to reverse and get rid of in our society. The key here, what connects obesity to diabetes, is the hormone responsible for diabetes. So insulin, as I mentioned, is responsible for getting blood glucose into cells. Diabetes occurs when your blood glucose levels are no longer controlled and your body has to increase the levels of insulin more and more to help get blood out of the bloodstream, get glucose out of the bloodstream. When you reach a certain threshold, it can't do it anymore, and that's when your blood glucose will start to rise. So insulin is the result of your body not being able to do with glucose what it needs to, and ultimately insulin has some other effects, and then there are other players in the hormonal pathway that are related to insulin. So not only will insulin tell glucose to go into cells, but it'll actually also tell our other cells, particularly our fat cells, that we are fed, that we don't need to be burning energy, we don't need to be burning fat, and we need to hold on to all of our energy. So it is a storage hormone, and it's a very powerful one. And so if you're trying to burn fat, if you're trying to lose weight and you have high levels of insulin, it is pretty much impossible. You can get it down temporarily and lose some weight, but you're more likely to lose lean muscle mass, and you really have to focus on the insulin part. So what happens when we eat? Well, we know that if we eat carbohydrates or protein, you can have an insulin response. Carbohydrates are more sensitive to insulin and more associated with a direct insulin response. Protein, you do need insulin to digest protein. If you overeat protein, you'll see a bigger response. But dietary fat does not have an insulin response. If you stop eating, you know probably that your blood glucose drops, your insulin levels will then follow and decrease. And then you can start breaking down the storage form of glucose, which is glycogen, as well as fat. And ultimately, that's the goal. So again, you have to get the insulin levels down before you can start burning fat. So how is insulin then related to obesity? Well, we know that in non-diabetic lean people that have no metabolic disorder, no metabolic disease, which again is probably about 10% of us, insulin levels are very low. So our goal really is to have people have insulin levels that are under 5 or under 3. People that are diabetic can have insulin levels of 100, 200. It can be very, very high. And while this is not true for everybody, if you were to look at the average person as they go through this graph of I'm not diabetic, but I've gained a significant amount of weight, particularly around my midsection, to now I'm pre-diabetic and have that same weight, or it's gotten worse, to, oh my gosh, now I'm diabetic and I have that same obesity problem, or it's gotten worse. You can see this linear trend of fasting insulin levels go up and metabolic dysfunction. So this has not always been related. There was a time not that long ago, this was about 30 years ago, where the dietary guidelines actually said that weight gain after the age of 18 was consistent with good health. There were some scientists, particularly Dr. Willett out of Harvard, who said, whoa, 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 if you look at people that are gaining weight, you actually see this parallel increase in diabetes. And it was at that point where they started to really say, gosh, maybe obesity is more than just a calories in, calories out thing. Maybe we should really be considering the fact that this insulin thing is related. And he put some numbers to that and said, look, if you've gained up to even over 17 pounds, which by most standards is not very much, your risk of type 2 diabetes goes up by almost 300%. So there is a very strong correlation there. And other hormones that we need to consider as well would include leptin and ghrelin. So leptin and ghrelin are two hormones that really haven't been investigated for very long. The papers that I saw when I started learning about these were from the early 2000s. And when we initially learned about these from a scientific standpoint, we thought, oh my gosh, we have the answer to obesity. We're going to give people leptin, which will tell them that they're satiated and they're not going to eat and they're going to lose weight. Well, it turns out that didn't happen. We're more complicated than that, and I hate to keep saying that, but it's true. But these are related, and there are ways that we can manipulate these. So leptin is a satiety hormone, ghrelin is a hunger hormone. We'll go through these. So ghrelin is secreted from your stomach. It is a response to hunger, but it does more than just tell your brain that you're hungry. It also plays a role in insulin sensitivity. So what is your body actually doing with that hormone insulin? And that's how these things are related. And there's some significance to what your skeletal muscle does with energy, as well as what your with what your liver does. Leptin, again, satiety hormone. This is actually secreted from your fat cells. So in theory, if your fat cells are getting bigger, getting stuffed with more fat, they should secrete more leptin, which should tell your brain that you need to probably decrease your hunger, decrease how much you're consuming, and increase your activity. So it should make you more active. But we know that in general, that's not true. And what's the literature identified pretty early on is that people actually did have high levels of leptin when they were gaining weight. But what happened is that the cells weren't responding to the message. So they were leptin resistant, which you'll hear the words insulin resistant. So this hormone resistance thing is actually a pretty big problem, and it makes these more difficult to deal with. Basal metabolic rate, I wrote a blog about The Biggest Loser and that TV show, and why basal metabolic rate is so important, especially for weight maintenance. I would encourage you to check that out. But basal metabolic rate, in short, is the amount of energy that your body burns by just being you. It doesn't include additional exercise, but just waking up, digesting, living, keeping your body warm and so forth. That rate can drop depending on how you lose weight significantly. And if it drops too much, it can make weight maintenance very, very difficult, as we'll see in the literature. It is the biggest component of what we consider energy expenditure. So when we look at how much calories out there is, basal metabolic rate is the biggest player in that, much more so than any exercise you could do. So if we look from a hormonal standpoint, as we are trying to lose weight and keep it off, our goals are to decrease insulin, decrease ghrelin, increase leptin or its sensitivity, increase or maintain our basal metabolic rate, increase or maintain our energy expenditure. And this other this other hormone, which I haven't mentioned yet, called epinephrine or norepinephrine, this is involved in our stress response, but there's a lot of evidence when we start talking about things like fasting, time-restricted feeding, where this plays a huge role in keeping our metabolism up, also in cold therapy, which we just posted on too. All right, so a couple of studies I want to talk about. There's a ton of literature out there, but I think these make the point pretty clearly. So this is a study from 2019 that looked at people that had successfully maintained weight loss for over a year. This was a 30-pound weight loss on average that people maintained for over a year. And what made these people different was that they had a higher daily energy expenditure than those that hadn't maintained, or the normal controls. And what's interesting about that is not that these people were working out more. That's not what we're showing here. What we're showing here is that these people were doing something that made them move more, that made their bodies have a higher basal metabolic rate, so their energy expenditure was higher. And this next study will show you some different ways that we can do that. What I wanted to point out too, though, is in this study, they showed that overweight controls, meaning that people hadn't lost weight, the energy expenditure was actually the same. And so it's not that these people are working out more, that they're hitting the gym for 2 hours every day. It's that these people didn't lose their ability to expend calories as they lost weight, and that is key. So this is a study from 2018 that looked at carbohydrates consumption and weight maintenance. So this is actually a really eloquent study, and I like the design, and well, I don't like all of it, but I like a lot of it. And the reason why I like it is because they used very clear arms in their maintenance phase. So there were a group of people that ate 20% of their calories from carbohydrates, a group that ate 40%, 60%. This was after they had already lost 12% of their body weight. So they had lost weight through a method I don't really love, but whatever, they all lost it the same way. And then they tried to maintain it for 20 weeks. They measured things like energy expenditure, the hormones leptin and ghrelin, and insulin. So during that 20 weeks, they provided them all of their meals. So this is relatively well controlled. They set the energy requirements such that they should maintain their weight, which I think is a bit of a flaw of the study. But overall, 74% of the participants were able to maintain their weight within 20% of what they had lost. So pretty good. It's a pretty good group to look at. All three of those groups, no matter how much carbohydrate they consumed, maintained their weight the same. But they looked at energy expenditure, again, the hormones, and also cholesterol. So this is what I want to show you, because gaining or maintaining your weight over 20 weeks is good, but we want to maintain our weight over 20 years. And that's a different discussion. So this is energy expenditure. And let me just talk you through these graphs. Look at the bottom one here. So the bottom one this is per protocol, which means that this is what people actually did, not the group that they were assigned to. And I could get into the details of that if somebody has that question. But the purple group is the low carbohydrate group. The pink group is the high carbohydrate group. And you can see that between 0 and 10 weeks, that people's energy expenditure went up from about 200 calories on average. So this is 200 kilocalories per day that it went up. I'll tell you that the people that had high levels of insulin when they started the study, this actually went up to the highest number I saw was over 700 calories. So the people that have metabolic derangement really respond well to carbohydrate restriction, which in the end, I think you'll see that just makes sense. The concerning thing is for people that are consuming a higher carbohydrate diet, that their energy expenditure went down. So this doesn't mean that they were working out less. It means that you might be seeing a reduction in your basal metabolic rate or your desire to actually be active. These other things that they measured, again, look on the right side, not the left side. So the per protocol analysis, this thing called 1,5-AG, this is the top right graph. This is a measure of being hyperglycemic, meaning that you have really high levels of blood sugar. As you can imagine, if you're consuming a low carbohydrate diet, that goes down and continues to go down. Over 20 weeks, if you're consuming a higher carbohydrate diet, it'll go up and concerningly may continue to go up, which we know if you have high levels of blood glucose, then you're going to end up with higher levels of insulin, and you may actually end up with diabetes. The middle one there is triglycerides, which go down with carbohydrate restriction. I just posted on a new talk on lipids and cholesterol, and these are the expected findings. So triglycerides would go down, which is good. HDL will go up, which is good. So in summary of that study, they don't have a graph for it, but leptin also went down. Now, if you were paying attention, you may have said, but wait, I wanted leptin to go up, not down. And what they posed is that the sensitivity to leptin actually went up, and that's why their leptin levels looked lower. They were lower because the leptin was actually doing more at the cellular level. Ghrelin had a large decrease for carbohydrate restriction. Energy expenditure increased, and particularly with those that were already metabolically deranged with high levels of insulin, and then lipid improvement. So carbohydrate restriction in this group demonstrated much improved hormonal response. All right, so if we go back to this energy balance hypothesis, so I hope that you can see now that it's more than calories in and calories out. Obesity does not result from just eating too much or exercising too little. People that are overweight are not gluttonous and slothly, if that's a word. But again, those are the words that are used in the early medical literature, and it just blows my mind. The first law of thermodynamics, we are not defying, and I'm not saying that a calorie is not a calorie. Calorie is a calorie. But let's look at that first law of thermodynamics. So it doesn't actually say anything about calories. It says this. This is what it actually is. This delta U equals Q minus W. This is a physics thing. So what that means is the change in internal energy of a closed system equals the amount of heat supplied minus the work done. So in other words, a calorie is a calorie, kind of. It assumes some things. So that is true only when these are independent variables. And I will show you these are not independent variables. And we can look at some very good examples of that. The idea of a positive energy balance leading to obesity, I think, is true. If you want to gain muscle mass, if you want to get bigger, you do need to eat more calories. We can't ignore that. But there are a lot of other factors involved there. So let's look at some examples. So child growth. What happens when kids are growing? They get hungrier, right? Now, are they force feeding themselves because they want to get taller? Sometimes, but not in general. They're just ravenous. They eat all the time. I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I can tell when they're growing because they're eating like crazy. That's a hormonal response to the body knowing that it needs to get bigger. It needs to feed those growing bones and muscles. So it tells the body that it's hungrier. It's not the desired change in the body. It's the hormonal response that's creating a change in the body. Same with exercise, right? So I want to exercise. I feel good. I want to train for a marathon, whatever. Yeah, that's going to increase my calories out. But what else is it going to do? It's going to increase my hunger. I'm going to have a hormonal response, which is going to say, whoa, you just ran 5 miles. You're training for a marathon. You got to eat more food. So again, the change in the body in that scenario shouldn't be that you're going to gain weight, although it might be. For some people it is. For me it is, because I overeat when I exercise. So I like to think of the hormonal theory like this. This is still the same equation, but I think it makes more sense. So changes in the body, particularly desired changes in the body, are going to equal hunger minus everything that goes out. So your basal metabolic rate, how much you're exercising, how much you're excreting. Some of that energy comes in and leaves your body without being converted. How much you exercise is really dependent on how you feel. How you feel is driven a lot by your hormones. Basal metabolic rate, driven by a hormonal response, which is driven by what you eat. Hunger is driven by all of those things. So all of these things are interrelated, and there's a hormonal response to nearly every component of this that can dictate all of these things. So this has been an argument, again, for a long time. These are from the early 1900s. Now, these guys, I think they had it right. This was Julius Baur thought there was a genetic responsibility. Gustav von Bergman thought, man, there is something hormonal going on with these fat cells that is causing things to right. Unfortunately, their theory, which was that, oh, and I love this. So their theory, which was that there's hormonal dysregulation, could be a genetic component. They actually use the term visceral fat. They use the term malignant tumor. Now, I know Dr. Ashley Lucas doesn't say malignant tumor, but she does say tumor. Is so because it is secreting its own hormones. It's secreting other factors that are encouraging you to eat more because it has an agenda, which is to get bigger. So these guys in the early 1900s actually already had this darn figured out. This is 100 years ago. And the United States actually started to pick up on this. In the 30s, they said, yeah, these guys might have something. We should really pay attention to this. And then World War II happened. And so these guys were German. This theory came out of Germany, and I think we all know the history there. So all that German literature was gone, and nobody wanted to pay attention to German literature. And that was also around the same time that Ansel Keys started pushing the diet heart hypothesis. Dietary fat is bad. We need to look at calories. Dietary fat has twice as many calories as carbohydrates. You should really eat more carbohydrates. Oh, man. And that's where things went wrong. So, yeah, I agree that carbohydrates do have half the calories of dietary fat, but the hormonal response to consumption of carbohydrates and protein is very, very different than that of dietary fat. So I would argue that dietary fat does not equal obesity. Dietary fat does not cause elevated cholesterol. Dietary fat does not cause heart disease, usually. Dietary fat, again, does not cause obesity. However, obesity is related to diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and heart disease. We know that these things are true, and the factor that seems to be consistent across the board is the hormonal response. And this is actually gaining more traction now. That's why you see people like Dr. Ludwig. If you haven't seen his sugar talks on YouTube, strongly encourage you to check those out. Very passionate researcher on carbohydrate restriction, particularly for children. So what is this thing that I keep talking about? Metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is the in-between. So diabetes is way over here. Normal, healthy, lean individuals are here. Again, I said not everybody gains weight and develops diabetes. A lot of people will have metabolic derangement and will end up somewhere in between. They might be tolerant to it to some extent, but we see people that have elevated blood pressure, elevated blood glucose, but not quite diabetic, fat around the belly, which we know is associated with heart disease and stroke, and that is also associated with abnormal cholesterol in the bad way, not necessarily in a better way. All these things are related to insulin resistance, which again is the hormonal issue, which is causing obesity in the vast majority of people. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is something that isn't talked about much. It really should be. It's also called NASH or NAFLD. It is the leading cause of cirrhosis and liver failure in the United States, more so than alcohol. combine it with alcohol. 1 out of 4 Americans has this, not very commonly diagnosed. Fatty liver is a problem. It slows down fat loss. It slows down energy burning. It gets in the way. And to reverse it, you have to change your diet. I also have looked at studies which are really interesting that demonstrate that if you consume a high, not even that high, consumption of fructose, you can stimulate somebody to have fatty liver in as little as a couple of days. I mean, it's that fast if you consume too much fructose. And when you consider the pillars of disease, which I've talked about in other talks, of heart disease, stroke, cancer, and dementia, these are the things that we are trying to prevent. And the basis of all of these things is metabolic disease. The basis of metabolic disease is your hormonal response to food. So obesity is related to all of these things. That's why it's so important. And the last thing I'll talk about is what's happening to our kids, what's happening to our young adults that are having babies right now. The rate of obesity in the young adult group is rising faster and faster every year. And there's this thing called perinatal metabolic programming. And what that means is that the things that are happening to our young adults while they're getting pregnant and having babies is making a change to the way the genetic imprint of these babies is being expressed as they are born. So what's happening is you've seen pictures of these obese babies, and I'm not talking about, fat, chubby, cute babies. I'm talking about babies that look like they have a pillow around them. What's happening is that they have, the mothers have high levels of glucose in utero, so that the babies are being exposed to all of this sugar. Their pancreas forms, their cells form in this environment, so that when they come out, they're already insulin resistant. They already have this thing, this internal starvation thing. That's why they have cravings. That's why they may not sleep well. That's why they have gut problems out of the gate. And that's why they become obese almost immediately, and they become pre-diabetic and diabetic at a very young age. And unfortunately, as this happens younger and younger and younger, these are the people that are then going to pass this on to their kids, and it's going to be a vicious cycle. We're going to continue to develop this in our genes, this genetic expression, if we don't do something about it. All right, so in summary, sugar, as I showed, is just being consumed more and more frequently in greater and greater amounts. And it's not because necessarily people are eating sugar as directly as sugar. They're not pouring it on their food necessarily. It is being added to so many foods in massive quantities. And there's a lot of misinformation about it. The fat phobia really fueled carbohydrate dominance, and we've been fighting that for the last 50 years. And it has a really unique metabolic role that includes high levels of insulin and other hormones, causes directly things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes. That thing I just talked about with perinatal metabolic programming is very concerning, and why we really need to address this in the young adult population. And I believe that is it. How much sugar is safe, right? So this is the concept of everybody's different. There are some people that can tolerate consuming a lot of sugar. Their genes seem to handle it. These are people that seem to be naturally thin and they can eat whatever they want. That might not be true. They might just look lean. They might actually not be metabolically well, but some people can consume high levels. There is a tremendous amount of individual variation. Your genetic profile will dictate this to some extent, but also there is this thing called metabolic damage or metabolic derangement that I think happens with multiple attempts at weight loss or prolonged exposure to high levels of fructose and sugar in the diet. And I think what happens is the people that used to be very tolerant to sugar are now less tolerant to sugar after all this up and down yo-yo dieting and restriction. So I think that is one of the reasons why people can't tolerate the way they used to, and why we have to look at carbohydrate restriction for folks. But ultimately finding out what works for you. So this is the slide. So I talked a lot about a lot of different things. This is a pretty complex topic. I think that the PhD approach does a really good job of finding what your individual variation needs. You could go down the rabbit hole in so many of these things. And if you want to learn more about these things, I am looking at changing my practice in a way that I could potentially help PhD clients look at specific labs, try to identify, a pathway that they could help themselves maintain weight better really is my focus on this. The weight loss phase for the vast majority of clients is pretty, I don't want to say it's straightforward, but the approach works. And so I would say for people that are near the end of their goal and would like to learn more, there are some other things that we could do. And you can just email or respond to the email that you get at the end of this talk and learn more about that opportunity. If that's not for you, that's totally fine. If you want to follow me on social media, these are my social media handles, and I try to add links to studies and comments about things that are in the public eye and common media platforms, and give our PhD spin on some of those things. And always looking forward to feedback.